Right. Let's get away with it. Right.
Does that work? Wow.
Does work.
That works, right. That's fine. Alright. Hi, my name is Fredrik. I'm here to talk about Swedish comics. And I'm going to use the comics format to do that and tell you why I'm here. I'm the editor of Bild Bubbla, which is the biggest journal in Sweden, maybe Scandinavia. Let's fight about that with Finland, I think. I write books about comics. I run a comics archive in Sweden. I run a comic art school where a lot of the current generations of Swedish artists were educated. I do research on comics, especially the meetup of comics and culture. My thesis was on comics and the Middle East, which is an interesting subject and an interesting meeting, I think. And I also do a lot of exhibitions. And like Ville said, there's an exhibition on Swedish comics here as well at the festival. Anyway, you're gonna hear some similar names that Ville mentioned. Normally when I travel, I need to explain to people where Sweden is at. I think in Poland, maybe people know that, but when I go to South America or even North America, sometimes you need to tell people where Europe is and they don't know. It's interesting to compare to Poland. Sweden is small, we're like 10 million people. We're bigger than Finland, but still small. That has a big effect on publishing, on what you can publish, how much you can publish, what sells enough to make money. But if you look at these sort of influences, they are similar, very similar. You can recognize the examples here. And if you're a comics aficionado, you know that there are three big cultures in the world. The French, Belgian, the American, and the Asian or Japanese. And these three have all had big influences on Swedish comics, since we are such a small country. And starting with, of course, Töpfer, which Ville mentioned, who's Swiss, not German, but no, who did sort of proto-comic books early first half of the 19th century. And they were published in Swedish, 1847 the first time, and immediately had an effect on the visual storytelling in Sweden. This is Fritz von Dalen, Swedish artist, who did this in 1853, so that's just 6 years after the book was published. Someone picked this up and learned how to do this. And this is sort of the story of Swedish comics, that we pick up things that are happening in the rest of the world, and we adapt and we do it in a Swedish way. Of course, we can't not mention Ville Busch, German artist who was big in the humor magazine markets in the second half of the 19th century. And he was published all over Sweden in these humor magazines that were also published in Swedish. And a lot of the Swedish artists were reading Busch and other similar artists from Europe. And we got, for instance, Oscar Andersson here, a big Swedish artist around the turn of the century, 1900. Mostly famous in comics history in that he started making comics that had recurring characters. Before him, it was usually one strip about one character and the next strip was about someone else. Andersson made strips with recurring characters, and that was a revolution at the time. We had also an influx of American comic strips, early 20th century. That was also very influential. Only thing was that in Sweden we weren't prepared for that. So we had most of the American comic strips redrawn and the speech bubbles removed, because the publishers didn't think the readers were ready to actually read and understand speech bubbles. So they were redrawn and the text was put below the panels instead, which was really, if you look at it today, they look really, really weird. And we had our own, of course, this is Adamson, which was the biggest success of Swedish comic strips. It was published all over the world in the 1920s and the 1930s, all up until 1945 and the Second World War. It was published in Japan, in China, all over Europe, South and North America. It was a very popular strip. A lot of it came from it being silent. There were no text. It meant that it didn't have to be translated. It could just be published all over the world, and was at the time. Now we also have an influx of American adventure comics that happened in the 30s, 40s, which also influenced Swedish comics, but not as much. Making realistic adventure comics is hard work, and for a country which at the time had maybe 6 or 7 million people, you just couldn't make a living out of that. So this never became a big genre in Sweden. We had, of course, the Disney comics, which was and are still a big thing in Sweden. The Donald Duck magazine is the best-selling comics magazine in Sweden, and have been ever since it started in the 1940s. And a lot of Swedish kids grow up reading Donald Duck magazine. We even had American publishers coming to Sweden asking, how can we get such a good sell-through as you have in Sweden with Donald Duck? And we tell them, you can't. You have to start in the 1940s and just keep going. So nowadays you have parents and grandparents buying subscriptions to their children and grandchildren, telling them you should read Donald Duck. And yes, it's an American comic, but it's mostly made nowadays in Denmark and Norway and read in Europe. So it's become sort of a European tradition. And in Sweden, that led to this comic, Bamse, which is very Swedish, started in the 60s, got its own comic book in 1973, and per issue, this is the best-selling comic book in Sweden by far. All Swedish children grow up reading Bamse and learning about society from that. It started as a very leftist comic, and it's still very much about the little people acting up against oppression and stuff like that, still in this very cute children's comic style. We also had the underground movements in the 60s and the 70s. We never got that translated at the time, but a lot of people bought these books and were inspired by the fact that they were breaking boundaries, doing new stuff. That was important for Swedish comics cultures and that development. And we had, in the 70s and the 80s, reactions based on these comics. And we had a lot of artists who started making comics that were more artistic, more literary, more expressionistic, if you want. And here's an example of Joakim Pilinen, who's sort of the grandfather of the modern adult Swedish comics. Not adult as in pornography, but adult as in geared towards an older audience. We also have had loads and loads and loads of French-Belgian albums published in Sweden. That has not led to a big market of Swedish artists making French-Belgian comics. People have tried, like here, doing comics that are based on Swedish history, but this has never become a big thing. Again, it's based on the fact that we are so few people in Sweden. In the 80s and the 90s, the autobiographical trends in the world, and especially in Canada, also influenced a lot of the Swedish artists. We're making a lot of Swedish artists trying to make autobiographical comics. Here you got Lubię Komiksy, who was and is very popular in Sweden, Canadian artist, and you have Åsa Grönvall, or Charleston as she's known right now, who did very hard-hitting autobiographical stories about domestic violence, which were published in the early 1990s. And that has been translated to a lot of languages. We also had a manga boom, early noughts, and that led to several generations of artists in Sweden being inspired by the manga style, wanting to draw comics in that kind of, not only style, but that kind of storytelling. The kind of storytelling where a short story is maybe 100 pages, and if you have a big project, then it's 20 volumes and 200 pages each. That's a totally different style of storytelling than, for instance, in the traditional European comics. Here you have Sword Princess Amalthea by Natalia Batista, which has been translated to quite a lot of languages all over the world. So are Swedish comics just copies of things in the rest of the world? No, they're not, of course. There are recurring themes, and I would say that this is one of them. The sort of anarchistic slacker. That's the quintessential Swedish character. And that is based on the fact that us as Swedes, we are very much in tune with our government. We do what the government tells us. If you go to Sweden and there are too many people to be served, we traditionally form a queue on our own. There's no mob or anything. We form a queue. We're very sort of organized people, and therefore our heroes are not. Our heroes are these anarchistic slackers. They are who we want to be, but mostly aren't, to tell the truth. Another trend in Swedish comics, which is very clear for me traveling, is that this last 2 or 3 generations, women have been dominating. Women have been the artists who have made the biggest splash in Sweden and abroad. And of course, Liv Strömberg being the artist who has made the biggest splash abroad. She's just now translated into Polish, and I saw a volume in Ukrainian from her as well. She's the Swedish artist published in most countries all over the world. I'll get back to her. So that was a quick, very quick, brief introduction to Swedish comics history. Now I'm going to talk about a few current Swedish graphic novels that are being translated and published all over the world. Daria Bogdanska, who did Wage Slaves. This is incredibly interesting being here. She's actually Polish. She came to my school in Malmö wanting to study comics. Did not get a government grant from Poland, so she had to work. She found out that the easiest thing to do in Malmö if you want work as an immigrant is to work at restaurants. And she soon found out that people who are immigrants and work at restaurants are treated like shit. And she got angry. She got involved. She started a movement with trying to get the workers to unite. And she actually finally managed to get several of these restaurants to have to turn and pay their employees better. But it took a lot of toll. And she made fanzines telling the story while she was at my school. And when she finished the school, she put it all together into a book that was published in Sweden, and it's been published all over the world since. Because it's not only about, fighting the power here, it's also about being young, being in another country. There are lots of themes that are recurring and that other readers in other countries can connect to. So this is a lovely book. And I know that the rights have been bought for Poland by Centrala, I think, but it hasn't been published yet, but it's going to be. Smålands Mörker by Henrik Romander. This is published in Polish. This is a beautiful, beautiful, thick graphic novel. It's sort of a autofiction. Tells the story of growing up in a small city in a rural area in Sweden, not having much to do, turning to comics, making autobiographical fanzines, but where the artist here became one of the more known Swedish writers of novels and graphic novels. The character is radicalized and turns to the far right and to violence. And it's a striking story which mixes things from the artist's upbringing and what's actually going on in Sweden right now in politics. It's a beautiful, beautiful book, and you can buy it just a couple of books down from here. Baby Blue by Bim Eriksson, also published in about 10 countries in the world. Fairly new book, has been given a lot of awards. It's a story set in a fictitious future where there's a fascistic government ordering everyone to be happy. And if you're not happy, if you're not well adjusted, they come and get you and put drugs in you to make you conform. And the main character does not want to conform, and she joins a resistance that works against the government. And it's also, again, it's a fiction, but it's also a comment on today and where we are at in our society. It's a very, very interesting book. Anneli Furmark, I would say, is the second most popular artist abroad, next to Liv Strömberg. She makes beautiful, beautiful graphic novels, which are almost, I would say, almost feels finished, in my opinion. She's a fine artist to start with, that started making comics when she was an adult, and you can feel that. These are stories about real people. They are not comics characters. And it's stories about relationships, about things that you experience. They are translated to quite a lot of languages, but mostly to French. French people love Nagrody Eisnera and her stories. And I don't think she's published in Polish, but if I would recommend one artist to start to publish in Swedish, it would be Nagrody Eisnera. When Nagrody Eisnera comes with a new book in Swedish, all other Swedish artists know that this is not a good year to publish your book, because she's going to win the awards. She always does. The juries and the awards givers love Nagrody Eisnera, as do I, as you can tell. Simon Gärdenfors, The Kompis, Dead Friend. This is a story about growing up and having one of your close friends die. And again, it's a hard-hitting story, it's autobiographical, but it's made even more hard-hitting by the fact that Simon is interested in retro design, in retro advertising, in retro design of candy packaging. And he's using those interests in the way he designs the book, in the way he designs the pages. And using those kinds of visual influence to tell a story about how a person close to you dies makes for a very interesting sort of contradiction in the visuals and the storytelling. Well, I love this book. It's available at least in English, I know. Matt Jonsson, one of the main representatives of the autobiographical generation, he has vowed to tell his whole life in comics. And there are books, there's about 10 books right now, from when he was a small child up until now when he's adult and had child of his own.
And also a new one coming.
There's a new one coming, yeah. Just
about the same people.
More about the Sami, which is the first non-autobiographical. It's going to be biographical, about one of his ancestors. Yeah, this is true. No, so he tells the story about his life, and this book is about him talking about the fact that he has ancestors in the indigenous people in Sweden, the Sami, and the Sami have been oppressed for hundreds and hundreds of years in Sweden, rather brutally by the Swedish government. So this is sort of his story about coming to terms with the fact that he has Sami ancestors. What does that mean for him and his personal life? It's a beautiful, beautiful book. Maybe hard to translate outside of Scandinavia, I would say, but it's a great, great book of non-fiction in comics. Knut Larsson, Knut Larsson is a very different artist. Again, maybe a bit Finnish in that he works a lot with the visuals. He's a person who doesn't tell straight narrative stories. He sort of picks out stories from his subconscious, from his dreams, and tell them in these very luscious, beautiful, colorful images. He's been published mostly in international anthologies. There are a few books out in French, but most of his stories are actually wordless, so you can buy the Swedish edition and read that. Moa Romanova, Antifuku, probably not translatable Swinglish, so this is why the Fantagraphics edition was called Goblin Girl, totally different. An autobiographic story. She was an influencer before she became a comics artist, so she tells us of that kind of life. It was nominated for an Eisner last year and actually won as the best translated comic book graphic novel in America last year, which is fun. This was actually made at my school as a project, so I was the sort of advisor on that.
That's fantastic.
It's a fantastic book. It's beautiful, beautiful. There was an interesting discussion. There's a person in this story, which is important for the story, acting rather badly, and that person is real, and it's a very famous person in Sweden. And we had a long, long discussion of if she could depict this person, could she name that person, would she be then prosecuted for that? And finally she came back with pages where she had drawn a paper bag over his head, so you can't tell. But it also makes him look stupid, and that is a shame. And it was such a good choice. I really, really loved that week when she came in and showed us that solution. Of course, as I said, the best seller of all the Swedish artists right now is Liv Strömquist, who makes, I think she always almost has made up her own genre of telling sort of essays on what's going on in our society, mostly seen through feminist lenses, and looking at it, talking about famous historical famous persons from today, and looking at how society has treated women throughout the years. Liv is coming here tomorrow. She's going to be here the whole weekend to sign her first book, which is published right now in Polish. Erik Svetoft, very different artist, who makes sort of almost surreal stories. The Spa book is again a very thick graphic novel set in a fictitious spa, where people never seem to leave. The people working there seem very surreal, all of them, and it's all got a very creepy sort of horror nightmare feel to it.
Very grotesque.
It's very grotesque, yeah, and you sort of get a feeling after a while that it is actually a social commentary on our society and what's going on right now. But it feels like a mix of maybe Charles Burns and some Japanese horror comics artists. It's a beautiful, beautiful book, but really, really hard to sit here and explain. So, again, it's available in Polish, so go and read it. Kim de Villamesson, making comics that are very much inspired by American traditional comics. Kim wishes that he could have been here. He has Polish parents, so he would very much like to be Polish in Poland, but he's not so far. He makes comics that are using the format of traditional comics from America or France, which are usually made for male readers, but he always uses female characters, and most of his fans and his readers are female. So that's a term on a traditional genre, I think. And his art is gorgeous, I think, as well. They, by Sara Efgren and Carl Jonsson. This is published in Polish, so you can get that. A two-part, huge graphic novel based on traditional Nordic myths, but sort of seen through the lens of the fantasy genre, and about a small person amongst the giants who has to be sort of the fighter and in the end fight of a long story. It's gorgeous as well. We have a person working for Marvel, which is sort of hard to get into, Maria Frölich. She did, for instance, Women of Marvel, but nowadays she's mostly making her own comic books and children's books, so she's not working that much for Marvel anymore. We have Lars Krantz making these beautiful, strange, bizarre graphic novels set in a fictitious Sweden, a Sweden that was involved in the First World War. We were not, but in this setting we are, and it's a very, very grotesque story of war and what happens to people during the war. And I would love for this to be translated, because I think this is on an international level, but that's still just available in Swedish. And finally, just to show that we have traditional comics as well, Lena Thurberg, who's been making comics about this little horse since 1973. We have a specific comic book for horse lovers in Sweden. It's been published since the 1970s, and it's still very, very popular, mostly female readers, and Lena Thurberg is the queen of this genre. She should be retired by now, but she's still making all these comics. Great artist.
There were some Finnish artists in the Minhest.
Yeah,
There
true.
were some Finnish artists in the 70s.
Yeah.
There, but not after that.
No. Well, that was Swedish comics. Very, very quick. Any questions? Everyone wants to go have a beer. I know I do. All right.
What has been the book that you personally are most enthusiastic about? Or
What
books?
about short comics?
Short stories. Well, we do.
Magazines?
Yeah. We have a couple of magazines. The biggest one is called Galago, and it's been around since 1979. So that's one of the oldest alternative comic books. Galago, and they publish 4 times a year an anthology. So that's the main place for shorter comics. We also have a journal called Sedon Anthology, which is more artistic, I would say, more experimental, and that's published also 4 times a year. So those are the 2 main. We had just recently we had a new one called Portal, which is more traditional genre comics, so more science fiction, fantasy, like that. Then we have a lot of traditional commercial comic books, but those 3 are the main ones. All right? Beer, coffee, whatever. Thank you so much.